Hey everyone, welcome back to the first tuah, where we dig deep into events that shaped our world in ways we might not expect. I'm Braden.
And I'm Cohen. Today we're diving into one of the most complex and devastating aspects of the Columbian Exchange and the diseases that came from it. How did the old world diseases disseminate populations in the Americas, and what lasting impacts did this have?
And to help us with this, we've got some special guests joining us. But before we get into that, let's quickly touch on what the Columbian Exchange even was for those who might not be familiar.
Right. The Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus, was a massive exchange of plants, animals, culture, human populations, and tragically, diseases between the Old World and the New World, starting in 1492 when Columbus made contact with the Americas.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating topic on Skibbity, but it's also a dark one. So much of the exchange brought death and destruction, especially from disease like smallpox, measles, and influenza, which wiped out millions of indigenous people.
And to give us more insight into the role disease played in the Columbian Exchange, we've got a historian who coined the term himself. Let's welcome Alfred Crosby.
Thanks, Braden and Cohen. Yes, I first wrote about the Columbian Exchange in 1972, and one of the most devastating parts of that exchange was the spread of the Old World diseases to the New World. The indigenous people of the Americans had no immunity to these diseases, and the result of the catastrophic, some estimates suggest that disease wiped out as much as 90% of the indigenous population in some areas.
Wow, that's bonkers. And that's just from the diseases, perchance?
Yes, disease was by far the deadliest element of the exchange. While we often think of things like warfare, forced labor as causes of death, disease alone far surpassed them. The Americas were essentially biologically isolated from Europe, Asia, and Africa before Columbus arrived. So when diseases like smallpox arrived, they spread like wildfire. It's hard to even imagine that the level of devastation. What's particularly tragic is that the most of indigenous people didn't know what was happening to them, and they had no concept of germs or how disease spread. Exactly, they had no natural resistance, and because these diseases often spread faster than Europeans themselves, entire communities were wiped out before they even saw a single European.
This sounds like a good time to bring in our next guest, someone whose voyages are the very center of the exchange. Welcome, Christopher Columbus.
I'm honored to be here. I've heard so much about how my journeys changed the world. Though I'll admit, I didn't realize just how much of that change involved death and disease.
Columbus, when you first made that contact with Americas, did you have any idea that this exchange would cause such a massive suffering?
No, none at all. When I landed, I was focused on wealth, gold, and bringing back riches to Spain. The spread of disease wasn't something we understood back then. We thought sickness came from bad air or divine punishment.
And yet, your voyages set the stage for many unprecedented biological exchanges. Many historians, including Alfred Crosby, argue that your arrival in the Americas had more impact than you ever realized.
It's sobering to think about. My crew and I were carriers of these diseases without knowing it. We were searching for a new land, but in the process, we unleashed forces to be beyond our control.
And disease wasn't the only thing you introduced, Columbus. This exchange also brought the forced migration of African slaves who were exposed to diseases as well. To talk more about that, we have someone representing the African perspective.
Thank y'all for having me. Now, when you talk about disease in the Columbian Exchange, you can't forget what happened to people like me. We didn't come to Americas by choice. We was forced. And those ships, Lord have mercy, it was rough. Packed in like cargo, we had no room, no clean air, and no chance to fight off sickness. A lot of us died from diseases before we even touched land. That's a crucial point. Diseases just devastate the indigenous populations. They also played a role in African slave trade. The conditions on the ships were horrific, and the diseases like dysentery and smallpox ran rampant. Oh, absolutely. Disease spread quick. We had no medicine, no clean water, dysentery, smallpox. It didn't take long for sickness to take folks down. Many of us, we didn't even make it off the ships alive. And those who did, well, the diseases in the New World were waiting for us too.
So what we're seeing is that disease was a key player across the board in Europe and Africa and in the Americas. The Columbian Exchange wasn't just about goods and people moving, it was also about germs moving too. Absolutely, it's one of the most overlooked aspects of the exchange. but it's also one of the most important in understanding why the world looks the way it does today.
It's strange to be a part of that history, knowing now the suffering that came from my voyages. I never intended for any of this.
Intentions don't erase the pain, Columbus, but understanding the full scope of what happened is important for healing and moving forward.
And that's what we aim to do on this podcast, acknowledge the complexities of history and the people it impacted. Disease was silent but deadly participant in the Columbian Exchange. Its legacy is still felt today.
Thank you to all of our guests, Alfred Crosby, Christopher Columbus, and our African slave for joining us in this conversation.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into the first tuah. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review.
Until next time, remember, history is more than a series of events. It's the story of people on some gang type shit.